So for the last topic today, we're going to be talking about finding the nth root of a perfect nth power monomial. So what does that mean? That means, so nth root is just general. So when we say the cube root of a, n is equal to 3, square root of a, n is equal to 2, right? And then let's go one more. So the fourth root of a, this is telling us that n is equal to 4. Right? So, and then again, I have some notes for you guys. One thing I really want to emphasize for you are these bullet points. So I mentioned this in a previous video. So when we're simplifying nth roots, so any the perfect squares, perfect cubes, fourth powers, fifth powers, it's really helpful to put them on a table to the side so you have quick reference instead of having to always think what is 4 cubed again. You'll have it to the side, which is really handy. Right? Another thing I want to say is, so in general, so we know for square roots, like the square root of a has to be positive. But for the cube root of a can be any real number. So in general, in an even root, so the square root, fourth root, sixth root, eighth root, any root that is even, a has to be greater than or equal to 0. For odd roots, a can be any real number. So odd roots, first of all, the root, you can't have a 1, right? So all roots are 2 or greater. So odd roots could be the cubed root, fifth root, seventh root, ninth root, and so on and so forth. Any of those, a can be any real number. So now, and there's just a couple of other things that you can read, but now let's do an example. So the directions say to simplify and to assume that the variable represents a positive real number. All right, so let's look at example 1. Example 1, we want to find the cube root of negative 125 y to the 6th. Right? So when we're solving this, so we notice there's the coefficient and there's a variable. What I highly recommend is using them separately. So using the multiplication property. And the multiplication property, I'll write it up here so we can refer to it later, property. So it's the square root of a times b. This is equal to the square root of a times the square root of b. And then, yeah. So how do I do that? This is for square roots, so let me give you the general. It's going to be the nth root of a times b. This is equal to the nth root of a times the nth root of b. Right, and that goes the same for the quotient property. Just add an n, and it'll be the same. Right, so now let's continue with our example. So before we continue, I noticed there's a negative in the radical. So what does that mean? We have to check the root. So n, in our case, is 3. Since this is odd, since n is odd, what does that mean? That means that this can be any number. Okay, there's no restrictions on what a can be or has to be. Right, so since this is odd, we are good. So now let's continue. So I'm going to use the multiplication property. Right, so what does this equal? This is equal to the cube root of negative 125 times the cube root of y to the 6th. So I made a negative 125 and b y to the 6th to be clear. Right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the cube root of 125. So you should have a little table. Me, I don't. So I'm just going to show. So 2 cubed, let's do that. So that is 8. 8 is not 125. So let's go to 3 cubed, which is 27. And it's also not 125. 4 cubed is 64, which is not 125. But 5 cubed is 125. right? The only difference between these is the positive and negative. So what does that tell us? That tells us that if I change this into a negative, so negative 5 cubed, this is going to be negative 125. So the cube root of negative 125, that is negative 5, right? Because negative 5 cubed is negative 125. Now let's do the cube root of y to the 6th. What is that? So let's rewrite it. So in general, let's refer to it again. In general, so the square root of a is equal to a to the 1/2, but in general, the nth root of a is equal to a to the 1 over n. So in this case, n is 3, so y to the 6th, this is the cube root of this is also that to the 1/3 power. And we can just use our exponential properties, and so we can multiply the powers. So 6 times 1/3, that is 6 over 3. 6 over 3 is 2, so this is y squared. Okay. And this is our solution. Right. Now on to example 2. Example 2, we still want to simplify, but this time we want to simplify the 4th root of negative 256 t to the 8th. So because there's a negative under here, what I want to make sure is I want to look at the root. So in this case, n is 4. 4 is even. Because it is even, what does that mean? That means that there could not be a negative number under this square root. Since there is a negative number, what does that mean? That means that this is not a real number. And that is our solution.